Okay, wonderful. Hello, everyone. Welcome to an East Central European Center event here at the Harriman Institute. My name is Christopher Caes. I'm the co-deputy director of the East Central European Center here. My co-deputy director, Chris Harwood, is in the audience with us here today. And we are pleased to welcome here today Klara Naszkowska. Klara is a Polish Jewish researcher, scholar, educator, writer, and organizer who holds a PhD in comparative literature from Edinburgh University. She is a cultural historian working on the history of East European women at the intersection of women's studies, gender, immigration studies, and Polish Jewish studies. She came to New York to pursue her research on the topic of today's talk, Jewish female mental health professionals in America, Poland, and Europe. And she began her work here as a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Graduate Theological Union. She is now a visiting scholar here at the Harriman Institute, where she has been continuing her research. We hope to have her here next year as well. She has 2 books under contract with Routledge University Press on the topic of her research. One on Klara Happel, Judaism and Psychoanalysis in America, Memory, History, and Interpretation, and the other one, an edited volume on the 4 mothers of psychoanalysis. And so today she'll be presenting material for her research. The title of her talk is Jewish Female Mental Health Professionals Between Poland, the Nazis, and America, Memory, History, and Interpretation. Let's welcome Klara Naszkowska here to it today.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, I'm just gonna start right away. It was very difficult for me to jam 3+ years of research into a 30-minute talk. So I'm gonna start. Sorry. Oh, it's okay. It was just I didn't want my background in there, so it doesn't matter. It's I think it's, let me see, I think it's my computer probably, or no. Yeah. I'll leave it like this for now. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly tell you about the origins of this project. It started when I was working on a different project on the Fulbright that Chris mentioned, on the Fulbright project, and I read this in one of the books about immigration, that there were 18 women psychoanalysts who immigrated from Europe to the United States between in 1930s and early 1940s. And I read this and I continued working on my project, but then when the pandemic hit and I found myself in very different circumstances, it came back to me. And I thought that as a mental health project, in a way, I would put together a list of names, because I knew right away with what I knew at that point about the first female psychoanalyst, that number 18 must be way too low. So very quickly, within I think a month or 2, maybe, I had 66 names, and now I have 87. So this shows you how many of those women were completely forgotten and erased from history. So that was the project I worked on for a while. And what I had to do to find out about those women, I started researching them after putting the list together, I started researching the whole diaspora. I had to go beyond the official historical sources, because those women were just not included in those sources, as it is typical for minorities who are excluded, like women and Jewish women, because out of those 87, 81 were Jewish with 2 Jewish parents. So I had to look at other sources, look for other sources and explore other sources. And those were personal history materials, which means memoirs, diaries, correspondence, personal notes, photographs as well, and interviews, including oral history interviews. What I also started doing was I started conducting my own interviews with children, grandchildren, friends and close colleagues of those women to fill in the gaps. And that, of course, that did fill in the gaps, a lot of the gaps, but it also brought me to this new field of memory studies and post-memories, which made it only more interesting, but also, of course, more complicated. So that's a brief introduction. At some point during this research, I realized that, so I was researching individual women too, and I published several papers about them. If you Google my name, you will find them if you're interested. But I also discovered that my initial plan to write a book about all those women is just not, this is just not going to happen, because I won't be able to write a book about 87 women, and no one will ever read that book. And if someone does, they will never remember anything. And my goal has always been to bring those women back, so that people can actually remember who they were, remember their names, and get to know their experiences. And I slowly moved from history of psychoanalysis to personal history of emotions, history of those experiences connected with immigration, with the Holocaust. And so that became more my field. So at some point, I decided to downsize the project to those women who were born in Poland. And there are 22 of them. And this is the group I'm going to introduce to you today, which was much more doable in a way. So I say that they were born in Poland, but actually at the time that they were born, Poland did not exist. So I divided them into two generations. The first generation psychoanalysts were born in 1870s and 1880s, second generation 1990s into 1910s. So they were born in occupied Poland that was divided into three partitions by three empires, by Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, and Prussia. But one thing is, I consider them Polish not only because they were born on that territory that used to belong to Poland before the partitions, but because they identified as Polish, their parents identified as Polish. I'm going to talk about identity components. Those women had very complex identities. So that Polish component was important to them and was important to their parents. And Polish language was the first language that they spoke. Usually at home, they only spoke Polish, sometimes with some Yiddish words thrown in. Sometimes German language was the second. Sometimes the families were bilingual and the German language was second. So most of the group of 22 came from the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria. That's called Galicia typically. For short, that was the partition that belonged to Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire. So around two-thirds, 14 out of 22 were born there. 8 were born in the Prussian partition and only 2 in the Russian partition. The subject of Galicia is enormous and very interesting. I'm not going to get into that. I'm also not a historian. I'm just a cultural historian. But the reason why the majority came from Galicia, there can be several reasons for that. One is that that was the most liberal partition, both for Polish people and for Jewish people. So they gave people living in Galicia the best access to education, including women. And it also had the largest Jewish population. It had several educational, intellectual, cultural centers like Krakow, Lviv, which is now in Western Ukraine, Tarnow or Przemysl. And it was relatively easier, I'm going to get to this point later, for women to get an education there. So I've mentioned a little bit about them being Jewish. So all of those 22 were Jewish with 2 Jewish parents. Typically, sorry, I was supposed to show you a map. I just saw my own note. Just a quick, am I in your way or is it, okay. So this is to show how huge Austria-Hungary was. The names of countries are how they are now. So you can see the part that belonged to Poland, the part to Ukraine, and so on and so on. When the empire fell in 1918 after the First War, what became Austria was 90% smaller when it comes to territory and population, roughly, than the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that part that overlaps with today's Poland, that was that belonged to Galicia. And here's another one, just to show you. So the pink, the filled in pink, that's Poland today. And the contour, the red contour is how Poland was when Hitler invaded in September 1939, just to show you a little bit of how complex the identity of those women were when they were born. That they were born Polish, they were born Galician, they were born Austrian at the same time. They were the first women to get an education, become professionals, and so on and so on. So it's just to show you that quickly. Okay, so like I said, all of them were Jewish with two Jewish parents. Typically, I'm going to make a lot of generalizations here because I don't really have a choice, but I'm going to also give you examples of particular women and their situation. So typically their grandparents were observant and even Orthodox, but their parents were usually not. They're sometimes partially observant, observe some of the holidays, some of the rituals, some of the Jewish customs. All of the parents were fully culturally assimilated. And like I've mentioned before, they typically, I haven't talked to all of them. I wasn't able to, because some women just didn't leave any memoirs. Some of them died earlier. Some of them died also before the first oral history project started in late 1960s. So it's impossible to get some of the information, or maybe I have not reached it yet, hopefully. But typically, the parents of those women identified as Polish, and that Polish component was more important to them than the Jewish one, or equally important. But again, typically, the parents' Jewish identity was rooted more in culture, tradition, and family, meaning like holidays were pretext to meet with the family, to sit together with the family, than in religion, than in Judaism. One exception in this group of 22 is Judith Kestenberg, who was raised in an Orthodox home. And I'm going to talk about her a little bit later because that's a very interesting case. And I'm going to talk about how the fact that she was raised with a very strong Jewish identity might have influenced her later decisions about her professional life, and how she, and that's an exception in this group, managed to connect her religious background and her Jewish identity with her work. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because it's all kind of mixed up. So all of those women were born in upper middle class families, intellectual bourgeoisie, or merchant class families. All of those families were either wealthy or very wealthy, which is important in that those families, the parents could afford to educate their daughters, didn't have to worry about marrying them into wealth. Fathers were usually cultured professionals, many of them doctors, lawyers, or businessmen, and very often they were respected by their local Jewish communities and played important roles in those Jewish communities, local Jewish communities. Mothers of the women we're talking about here were usually homemakers, and they usually didn't have higher education because it was just impossible for them to get it. And unfortunately, we usually know much less about them than about the fathers for a number of reasons. One is that, there were less public figures, so there's less documents that I can access, but also those women, the daughters, if they gave interviews or they wrote memoirs, they would talk about their mothers significantly less than about their fathers. And the same situation goes to the interviews that were conducted with them. They were more asked about their fathers than their mothers, but also as a rule, which is what was upsetting to me as a cultural historian, they were usually asked about their work, but also very often about their connections to Freud or some other famous men, and then their husbands. And it was often just a pretext to talking to them was just a pretext to find out about the men. Okay, so an example, Helene Deutsch She was the first generation psychoanalyst, born in 1884 in Przemysl, which is now Przemyśl in Poland. And she became later in 1925 the first director of the Training Institute of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. So she was a very prominent psychoanalyst. She later immigrated to Boston, where she also was a very famous psychoanalyst. She was, I'll show you a picture of her. So her father, Wilhelm Rosenbach, was a lawyer and a scholar of international law. This is Helena in her later life. She lived to be 98, and she left a memoir, which was really amazing of her, and a lot of interviews. So she's one of those who is kind of well known, usually in small, tight-knit circles, but still. So her father, Wilhelm, was a culturally assimilated, non-religious Jew, but also a very important figure in the town's Jewish community. And according to Helene Deutsch, their house, quote, was a microcosm of the Polish Jewish society of Przemyśl at that time, end of quote. He was also the first Jew to be appointed as a juridical representative of Galicia to the federal court in Vienna, which was a position almost unheard of for a Jew at that time. And Helene Deutsch, many times in her memoir and in the interviews, and she gave a lot of interviews, she very often said that she identified with her father, that she was his heir, that she was his boy, and she also very often said that she hated her mother. She wanted to study law like her father did, but that was impossible because women were not admitted in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Actually, that was already after the empire fell until 1919 to study law. So she couldn't do that. And that, identification with the father was very typical for those women. They often said that their fathers were typically better educated, more liberal than the mothers, and they're also more vocal about women's education, which is not a judgment in any way. It's just different times, different situations, but that's also a fact. And they very often rejected their mothers' more conventional values, and they fought their mothers. Okay. So another example would be Judith Kestenberg that I've mentioned before. That's the one who was born in the Orthodox home. I have one photo over here. Also in later life, also after immigration to New York. So Judith Kestenberg, like I said, came from an Orthodox home, and she, where her parents had a very strong Jewish identities, and she had one too throughout her life. She said until the end of her life, she would say that she has that strong Jewish identity, that she is Jewish, that's important to her. And that's very rare for those women who would usually not talk about being Jewish or even pretend that they were not Jewish. And so her case is different in many different ways, but when it comes to parents, it seems that her mother, Sarah Silberfrenning, played an equal, even a larger role in Judith's and her sister Helen's, who became a very famous lawyer in America later on, decision to attend university and have a career, because her mother was vocal about women's education, and she did insist that her daughters get an education. She also attended University of Krakow courses in secret before marriage. That was absolutely forbidden. She spoke 6 languages fluently. She read Hebrew poetry, played the piano, and when the family finances were in big trouble, and they ended up almost completely broke, actually, because of Judith's father's decisions, bad financial decisions, the mother started to study economics in private lessons to help out. And then when she was 36, when her older child, her son Henry, went to study political science at the University of Vienna, the mother also, she went with him under pretext of saving him from, I can't remember the quote, but something like evil women, where he was actually gay, which was a little complicated. And the decision was to get him out of the small town of Tarnów. it is in Poland. But anyway, she went with him and she audited the courses at the age of 36. That was really unusual. Okay, so the fathers of those women, well, parents, but usually fathers were more vocal about it, provided their daughters with financial and moral support to pursue higher education and professional careers. And that's a gap between their mothers and them. Their mothers didn't have that support. And also there were not really, women were not accepted to universities at that time. So one reason for that is that they could afford, like I mentioned before, to support their daughters. They didn't have to marry them into wealth. Second of all, the fathers were typically educated. They had received some form of higher education. Could have been a gymnasium, which was this 8-year secondary school, which was a college level, like that's how we describe it now, or a university education. And they knew the benefits of being educated. So they wanted this for their daughters. Additionally, education has always been of special value to Jews. This was one reason behind this, was to give their daughters something that could not be taken away from them, like their possessions, citizenship, or life. So an example of Jenny Valder Hall, who was born in a less affluent home, there were 3 sisters, all of them got PhDs, and all of them were absolutely brilliant. And that's also a fascinating family story. But Jenny Valder's whole father reportedly said to his 3 daughters, quote, "Listen, kids, you won't get any dowry, but you will get an education," end of quote. Okay, so access to education was much harder for the first generation psychoanalysts born in the 1870s, 1880s. And I'm going to give you an example of Helene Deutsch's story. I can put her back on. I don't have many photos. I wanted to make it a little bit more exciting, but there are not many photos, and that's her. So Helene Deutsch, again, born in 1884, she didn't have her parents' support to go to university, and she didn't finish a gymnasium, which was this 8-year long secondary school, which was also almost the only path to university, because it ended with an exit exam. It was called the Matura or Abitur, and that was this entrance ticket to university. And without it, like when she finished a different type of school, a Lyceum, that was much more difficult because the Lyceum didn't end with that exam. So, but her parents didn't really, even her father, with whom she identified so strongly, who was so important to her, he also didn't really support her idea of getting an education. And when she was 14 and graduated from that Lyceum, both her parents wanted her to get married soon, but not get any other education. So, for example, according to Helene Deutsch, this is from her memoir, her mother believed that, quote, "A girl from a good family does not go to a university," and she strenuously opposed her daughter's plan to study medicine, and before that, even to study at a university. And then medicine was really a no, because medicine was meant, and that was a problem for many, for those from more orthodox or more religious homes, because medicine meant looking at naked corpses. So that was a problem. But Helene Deutsch also said, "My mother had no influence on my education, and her contribution to my intellectual values only existed in a negative sense. I reacted against hers." End of quote. But Helene Deutsch came up with an ambitious plan. And she threatened her father, with whom she was very close, that she will leave home if he doesn't sign a contract that she prepared. And in that contract, which he signed after negotiations, the contract said that he will help her get ready and pay for private tutors so she can take that exit exam, the Matura exit exam, and go to university. he signed, he paid for the tutors, and it took about 5 years to get ready. She had a lot to make up for because she didn't go to a gymnasium. And she passed the exam. That was 1907. So she got the matura, she passed the university entrance exam. She had to have a special permission to take those exams because she was a woman as well. And in 1907, she enrolled in the medical school at the University of Vienna. She was at that time one of only 7 women to do it. There were about 500 students, and only 3 of those 7 women would graduate with a medical degree. So generally speaking, those who were second generation psychoanalysts had a very different situation. They would usually go to a gymnasium. Their parents would usually support that. At that time, there were only private girls' gymnasia, but still they would do that. They would study for 8 years, get a matura, enroll in the university. Which, when I say it now, it sounds very easy. It wasn't that easy, but it was much easier than for those who were first generation analysts. Okay. 15 out of 22 of those women I'm talking about today went to a medical school. Medicine was a typical choice for a number of reasons. One is that was a practical choice. So that the idea was that it leads to financial independence. It leads to women helping men. That was especially true for more Orthodox homes, that there was this custom of women helping out financially so that men had more time, for example, to pray. But that was a practical choice. Many of those women also were daughters of doctors. An incentive. And most of those 15 studied in Vienna, in a Viennese medical school, which was the most famous, most prestigious medical school at that time. And if you remember, all of those who were born in Poland, but under the Austrian rule and the Prussian rule, they all spoke perfect German. So that was not an issue for them to study in German. Okay. Okay, I can read a quick quote from Kestenberg, who said about her choice of medicine. She said, "I had to choose a subject that could sustain me and maybe the family. I definitely had to stand on my own 2 feet." So I want to say a few words about the conditions in which they studied. They very rarely mention anti-Semitism or misogyny themselves. If they're pushed, like if the interviewer pushes them, they just mention it in passing. They usually don't say they experience any personal anti-Semitism. But the truth is that in 1910s, 20s, and 30s, when they studied in Austria, in Vienna, Austria was very anti-Semitic. And this, as we call it, collective amnesia of Austria now suggests to us that Austria was actually the first victim of the Nazis during the Anschluss, the annexation, March 1938. But the truth is actually very different. The German troops were actually enthusiastically welcomed in Vienna when they marched in. And the reason for that is also that anti-Semitism started in Austria way earlier. And the country was really a stronghold of anti-Semitism and racial violence much earlier before the annexation. It started, it's just a very quick note, but it started in the 1880s with the Conservative Christian Social Party, which was led by Karl Weger, who was also the mayor of Vienna between 1897 and 1910 until his death. So the medical school in Vienna became infested with eugenics and racial hygiene in the period of Austrofascism. That's between 1933 until the Anschluss in 1938. And this process of the Judification of Austro-German medicine, which was predominantly Jewish, led to a dismissal of many non-Aryan so-called professors and lecturers who were replaced by political appointees who adhered to the Nazi principles, who were not as qualified, but political appointees. And then after the Anschluss, the remaining Jewish faculty and students were expelled very quickly. And one historian, Ezert Ernst, who researched that, said that it was, quote, a remarkably smooth and quick running operation with little opposition being voiced by colleagues remaining in the faculty, end of quote. So just 3 days after the Anschluss, which the official annexation of Austria happened on March 13, 1938. So 3 days later, Eduard Pernkopf was named Dean of Medical School, and he was the one behind quickly laying off all the remaining Jewish faculty. Those who were not laid off had to submit this proof of an Aryan descent and give an oath of loyalty to Hitler. And I want to show you a photograph that I think is just a very powerful photograph, but also it's a trigger warning. It's very triggering. So if you need to look away, feel free to look away. This is several days after the Anschluss. He's giving a speech in an auditorium of the Vienna Medical School. That's how it looked. That's him giving the speech. So also a quick note about him. Pernkopf had a very successful career during the war and after the war. He became the president of the University of Vienna in 1943, and he held that position until 1946. But he's most known today as an author of a monumental atlas of topographical human anatomy, which he was the main author of it, but all of his collaborators were also Nazis, vocal about their affiliations. None of them were charged with war crimes. He served just 2 years of labor in a prison camp, and it wasn't until mid-1980s that his Nazi past was actually brought to light, and there was an investigation which revealed that they almost certainly used cadavers of executed prisoners as their subject for the atlas. The atlas was decorated with Nazi symbols like the swastikas and with commentaries. He added commentaries to it. And all of those were airbrushed in the late 1960s. But the publishers stopped publishing the atlas in 1994, so it took a while, and still there are used copies circulating, and it's been translated into English in, I forgot to write it down, I think in the 60s, and it's the main atlas used by medical students around the world still, and there's a big debate, if you're interested, if you type it in, I need to turn this off, about whether it's okay to use it or not. There are a lot of voices for still using the atlas. Okay, so most of the women we talk about today graduated before the Anschluss. The youngest one of the group, Olga Vermeer, who was born in 1913. I'm going to show you a photo of her. This is actually a photo that was taken by Trude Fleischmann, who was a very famous photographer who also immigrated later to New York. So her story quickly. So she was set to graduate in the spring of 1938, and then she was expelled from the university within weeks of the Anschluss with all the other remaining Jewish students. She immigrated to the US, and then she went back in March 1939 to complete her studies in Lausanne in Switzerland. She finished her classes, she got her PhD, and then she got on a ship back to America in mid-August 1939, 2 weeks before Hitler invaded Poland. Another example, Judith Kestenberg, the Orthodox, she graduated in 1934, but she was training at the neurology and psychiatry clinic at the university. At that time, the head of the clinic was Otto Potts, who was a Nazi. He was the head of the clinic since 1928. All of his assistants and a lot of other employees were Nazis, members of, at that time, secret members, because it was illegal until the Anschluss. It was illegal in Austria to be a member of the Nazi party, but they still were. And members of brown shirts, paramilitary wings, and so on and so on. And Kestenberg worked very closely with some of them, especially Walter Birkmeier, with whom she discovered this rare tumor and wrote a paper. This is an example of disassociation and denial, and about talking about the past and seeing the past, and about memory. So she said, she made several statements throughout her life, and she never altered them. She would say something like, quote, "My best friends in the neurology department were Nazis, but I didn't know it. I was so naive that I, unlike everyone else at the clinic, did not know that Birkmeier and Ausberg were Nazis." Or also, she also said, "I didn't really believe it until Birkmeier sent me our reports," which was this report they wrote together. But most importantly, he sent her a note with the report, which said, "I wish you could see the amazing things happening in Germany at that time." She was already in New York at that time. She also continued to say things like, "I did not flee the Nazis. I left Vienna in 1937 to continue my training in New York." So she kept on insisting on the fact that the sociopolitical situation, the persecutions, the threat that she was under, and as a Jew, a psychoanalyst, and a socialist, actually like a triple threat, and immediate danger, really did not affect her decision to immigrate. Which is, again, not a judgment at all. It's just trying to show how they thought about their past, because that's very typical. Okay, so about immigration, there were two peaks of immigration, of this wave of immigration. The first peak was right after Hitler was named chancellor in January 1933 until the beginning of 1934, and that was immigration from Germany. At that time, those who were in Austria, psychoanalysts, intellectuals, artists, they would usually, Jewish, they would usually assume that they are safe and they wouldn't immigrate. We can talk about it later, because I see I'm kind of running out of time. So we can leave it for later about why they thought that. There are a lot of reasons. But they wouldn't immigrate until after the Anschluss, so after March 1938. That was the second peak of immigration. So one of the things I discovered that probably, wasn't surprising, but was still upsetting, was how difficult it was actually to immigrate to the United States. So first of all, there was a 1924 Immigration Act, which actually went into effect in 1929, which was designed to curb the arrival of so-called undesirable immigrants, which included Jews, Asians, and Africans. I'm only going to focus here on the immigration from Europe. It's a much larger problem, but I'm only going to talk about this. So there were two types of quotas that were then put in place. The first was a total quota, which meant a total number of immigrants from Europe per year. And that was a little less than 165,000. And then it was again brought a little bit lower, but that was about 80% reduction from the pre-World War I average. The second type of quota was called national origins quota. That was set at 2% of the total number of individuals from each country who were in the United States at that time. Is that clear? Sorry, that's a hard one to explain. That was based on the census. So the census showed how many of each country are there in the United States, and 2% of that could immigrate each year. The problem with this, the second problem, apart from the fact it was 2%, was that was calculated using an older census. They didn't use, the Congress didn't use the latest census from 1910. They used the census from 1890. because that one showed a lower number of immigrants from specific places, and especially from Eastern Southern Europe. So the white immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, from Scandinavia, UK, and Germany, they got about 85% of the quota slots because of the census that was used. And then, of course, I'm guessing you know that the largest Jewish community by far was in Eastern Europe. So that worked against the Jewish immigration. And that system, there was racist, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic immigration system reflected the general sentiment of the country at that time in the 1930s and during the war. As an example, a Gallup poll that was taken just 2 weeks after the Night of the Broken Glass in November 1938, which was very well documented in American newspapers, showed that 72% of Americans were opposed to increasing the quotas and letting more refugees, Jewish refugees, into the country. So as the Nazi persecution in Europe intensified, then the war broke. The US State Department did not increase the quotas, did not help Jewish refugees in any way. And indeed, actually, they continued to impose more and more restrictions, which made immigration more and more difficult. Just also to show you how the quotas worked. So after the Anschluss, the Third Reich, which went under the German quota, that was Germany, annexed Austria, and also part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. There were about 530,000 Jewish people living there. And that's just Jewish, because the quotas were not for Jewish people, they're for Europeans, but 530,000 Jewish people. And the annual quota was 2,700. Another thing to have in mind is that the State Department viewed quotas as limits, not as goals. So the German quota was filled only once during that period in 1939. It just went unfilled because it was so hard to even get to the interview, to have all the documents. And then during the interviews, consuls were advised to not give visas to those who were likely to become public charges, as it was called, those who were lunatics or idiots. They were looking for skilled applicants. They were actually, no, it's okay. I was going to say there were organizations who were making lists of those who we would like to have. Okay, I'm going to skip quickly all the requirements and restrictions. There were a lot of them, different affidavits of support, moral affidavits, and so on and so on and so on. And maybe I can end over here with this part. So I've mentioned a little bit about how complex their identities were, multicultural, multinational. But I want to talk about if it was important to them and how did they relate to the fact that they were Jewish and Polish, and if they talked about the pre-war past. So, of course, they were driven out of Europe by anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish violence, but they, if anyone asked, if there was a chance to ask, they would say that being Jewish was not important to them at all. They wouldn't even say that they were Jewish, typically. They would, they would say that they were born Jewish, but they don't identify in any way with being Jewish. Most of them didn't bring their children as Jews. They didn't celebrate any customs or Jewish traditions. So also very, very typically, and that's typical for all Jewish refugees, not only psychologists, not only women, was to not talk about the past at all, to repress it, to suppress it, to push it away, to try to draw this hard line behind the past, to start anew, which I also was thinking that it kind of goes with this American, like, how you say, like, pull yourself by the bootstraps kind of thing. Like, let's just erase this, let's start again, let's reinvent ourselves. And they very often did. I don't like, people often say that these are stories of success, which is very unfair to say, but in a way they were in professional, when it comes to their careers, they were. But the issues of trauma and loss connected with the Holocaust were generally absent for psychological literature. And there's another aspect here, because we're dealing with mental health professionals, so who didn't talk about the traumas and losses. And okay, I'm skipping here. Okay, I want to read you some examples of how they didn't talk about the past, or how they talked about this. So one example is Jenny Valder Hall, who linked Jewishness and Polishness. That was the same thing for her. And she denied the knowledge of the Polish language, for example. She would say, quote, that she wasn't Polish, had nothing to do with being Polish. That was from an interview her grandson did with her. And her daughter added, I didn't even realize until maybe in my adulthood that my mother had been Polish. It was not something she was proud of. She didn't bring it up. She liked to think of herself as Viennese. She never thought of herself as Polish, always Viennese. That's one example. Another example, Alberta Shalita, who severed all ties with Poland after coming to the US. And looking back, at the age of 95, she wrote, quote, 2 lives, 2 beginnings. My life is divided almost equally in half. My early life, the first half, is in Europe. The half I'm living now is here in the States, in America. The gulf, the abyss that divides them is the Second World War. I was going to tell you a bit more about her earlier, but she lost her entire family in the Holocaust. That's a context. I think if I have to finish, I can finish here.
The same. I think if there's some back there, if you guys want to grab it while we are gathering for our Q&A here, if you feel free to do so. And I think I'll maybe just start off with one of the questions that I have, if I could. I was really interested in the relationship between the women you discussed and their fathers. And I noticed that you talked about how the project had its origins in a history of psychoanalysis, or essentially thinking about these women in the context of the origins of psychoanalysis. And I know you moved away from that into memory studies and biography and cultural history and so forth, but still, it seems to me to be noteworthy that we think of psychoanalysis as this theory of the mind with the emphasis on the role of the father in early childhood, and in a sense, all of that is confirmed in the lives of these women. They all sort of gravitate toward the father, think of the father as the the moral authority, the financial authority, and they some of them seem even to, as you said, have a negative. Helena Deutsch has a negative relationship to her mother. So it's almost like there's a mirror image thing going on. Is there an argument about the origins of psychoanalysis here among Jewish medical professionals and the Jewish family, and the role of these wealthy middle class doctors and lawyers and their relationships to their daughters and so forth? Is that something that is a productive avenue to explore?
Oh, I don't know. It's not an avenue I took, so I don't feel 100% comfortable talking about it. It is, I mean, psychoanalysis is rooted in I would say I was going to say in truth, but it kind of sounds, but it is about observing the family ties a lot. So yeah, I mean, all I can say is that it does overlap. Like this is, but there are many different stories. I mean, there's Helena Deutsch, the one I read to you. She really keeps on saying how she hated her mother, and she would speak that so persistently. But her mother was very, and again, Helena Deutsch is representative of this first generation, which there is such a big difference. Like there's a big gap between those two generations, how the family dynamics worked, and a lot of those women had mothers who nurtured them, even though they didn't have an education like their father, like their husbands, like the fathers. So they're different stories too. That's the one I read, and they did typically identify with their fathers a lot when it comes to profession. They often chose similar professions, similar careers, and they couldn't do that with the mothers. I hope that.
Yes,
that's
thank you, yeah. And if I could, just one more question, the careers that they embarked upon in the States, they stayed within the mental health profession. Did any of them go into teaching or publishing? Did they leave behind a body of work that we can look to today, or were they primarily involved with individual patients? What did their sort of practical work look like in the States after immigration?
So a very interesting thing is that, I found it very interesting, is that all of those women, and all of the 87, they continue their careers as psychoanalysts. And I skipped that part, but those who had medical degrees, because in the US, psychoanalysis was always from the very start was part of medicine, was a medical specialty. What was different in Europe, it absolutely wasn't, and Freud was absolutely against that, actually. So it wasn't a requirement in Europe to have a medical degree, but many of them did. So those who had that, they still had to, here in the US, pass a state medical exam, which was in English. It was very comprehensive, it was very hard. Like, they were years out of medical school and didn't really practice medicine. So that was kind of going back to school, having to pass that exam. And even though they typically spoke 3, 4, 5, 6 languages, English wasn't usually one of them, or it wasn't one of the that they were most fluent in. So passing that exam in English to start making a living, and they came with almost broke usually because they couldn't bring money or they didn't have the money to bring. So that was very hard. And for those who were not who were not doctors, who didn't have a medical degree, it was much harder because they had to get one to even work as psychoanalysts. So many of them, but child analysis was different. That was treated differently. You didn't have to have a medical degree to practice child analysis for whatever reason. It's weird, but that's what it was. So many of them started doing that. So they continued to be psychoanalysts, but they went into child analysis. So that's one thing. But I read this article. I'm sorry, I can't remember who wrote it, but it was a comparison between female doctors who came to the US who weren't analysts and psychoanalysts, and they were very different paths. So all the psychoanalysts, they continue with their careers, and like I said, this way of saying that these are success stories, they reestablished themselves, they had amazing, brilliant careers. And medical doctors who were not psychoanalysts, I can't remember the numbers now, but like a significant percentage of them didn't. And there was whole analysis of how that happened, how different the background for psychoanalysts who were women. Like when we talk about Freudian theories today, we see how misogynistic he was, but the psychological movement was very receptive to women. Women were accepted, and they, like I mentioned, Helena Deutsch, who was the first director of the Training Institute in Vienna. That was a huge position. So they published, they lectured, there were teachers. And so that was one background they came here with that the female physicians didn't have. So that's one part of my answer. Another would be that, so they did a lot of different things, but one of the reasons why many of them are forgotten is because many of them didn't publish. So they just, they just disappear because their publications, they don't live in their publications, their names are not repeated. Many of them simply sell patients, and that's also why they disappear. But they usually worked in hospitals and had private practice. Some of them that really depends. Some didn't publish anything, some published a lot. Some were directors of the psychoanalytic societies. Some started a lot of societies and institutes. Many of them were teachers. They were usually teachers, at the training candidates.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Let's open it up to the audience here. Would anybody like to ask a question? Question out there? Yes, Chris Harwood. Yes, thank you.
Two questions about identity of your subjects. One is, what were the languages that you were reading their correspondence and diaries and memoirs in? And were any of your subjects or their close associates ever drawn to Zionism?
Oh, languages, it depends on when the documents were written. I mean, language is a big question, I think very interesting because our identities are rooted in language. So are you asking more like which languages they spoke or which languages they choose to publish in? Or
what are your research, particularly when you got into private documents, whether again, correspondence, memoirs, diaries, what were those?
Well, if they some of them were in Polish, some were in English, some were in German.
All three.
These three languages. Yeah, but I was very interested. That's one of the questions I would always ask people I talk to, their children, grandchildren, and so on. What language they used? Because I was very curious about that. I think a very interesting example is Olga Vermeer, who was Polish, but then she studied in Vienna in German. Her German was perfect. Her husband was Austrian, so his first language was German. Her children are born here. That's also a factor. If the children were born in Europe, what was the first language for the children? Her children were here. She was the youngest one of the group, born in 1913. So, and also the children were brought up there, Americans. So she lost her almost entire family in the Holocaust in Poland. And she, for example, absolutely refused to go back to Poland. Actually, same with Germany, and she never wanted to buy a German car or like anything made in Germany. But she didn't have an issue with Austria, to where she traveled. But that's something that's typical for the other women, that Austria was the one that they were most upset with because they felt like Austria betrayed them. Like it often feels like they expected this of Poland, a very anti-Semitic country forever, but not of Austria. That was a betrayal, but not for her. But so she didn't teach her children Polish, but she spoke Polish to their dog. And that's how one of the daughters learned a little bit of Polish, for example, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But they wrote in different, I'm trying to remember now. I was surprised, for example, that Judith Kestenberg wrote in her memoir in German. But they would very often, I think that, well, that's a generalization again, but they wanted to Americanize as soon as possible. Like I looked at petitions, naturalization petitions, they're filed very early. And they really try to be part of this society here and contribute to it too. And they learned English, and I think typically they would switch to English to be more part of the society, the community, and to they had to talk with their patients.
The Zionism question.
Oh, sorry, I forgot. I'm trying to remember now because I don't think any of the women, but very often they're sisters. For example, so for example, Tarnow or Tarnów was a big center of Zionism, and I'm trying to remember now who that was, but from Olga Vermeer's family, there were a lot of Zionists in that family. Her aunt was married to this famous Zionist, Schenkel. And I just found a document yesterday about another member of the family also being one of the leaders, but none of the women. But psychoanalysis was kind of staying away from politics in a way. I mean, all of those women were socialists to some degree, social democrats, socialists, even Marxists or communists. That was just like, it was obvious. That was who you were. But they were very rarely very politically active or vocal about it. And then And then there was this, Freud was sick already at that time, but Anna Freud and Ernst Jones, who was in the UK, and he was not Jewish, and he was kind of this mediator trying to get many immigrants out, but he was controlling the narrative a little bit about politics, and the idea was to stay low, not, like keep your head down, because it was more important to them to preserve psychoanalysis and movement, preserve the institutions, the publications, all of that, then really help people. And like one of this woman I'm writing a book about, Klara who's German, she was not Polish. She wanted to get out, and Ernest Jones didn't really want to help her because she was one of those who were very vocal. She was an anti-war and an anti-Nazi activist and a feminist, and like they didn't really help her. She got out on her own as a single mother with 2 children. She still made it, but she was like there's correspondence between him and Anna Freud saying, well, no, with her, like let's not help her. She's an issue. She's a problem. So I mean that's kind of around your question.
Yes, thanks. Question over here from I.
So following up a little bit on, thank you so much for the presentation. Following up a little bit on Chris's question, I wanted to ask about their identity when they came to America. Because you said it before, the Jewish component of their identity was sort of like pushed to the side and not very important to them. They would identify as Viennese or whatever. Did that change in America? Because the sort of the perception of Jewish identity in America is so different than in Europe, and I was wondering if this sort of encouraged them to reconnect with their Jewish identity, or was it still pushed?
Well, that's a tough question, because most of the information I get is from later publications. They wouldn't really, if they wrote a memoir, that was years after coming to America, usually. So filtered through all the experiences and how the memory works. And what I said about them not identifying as Jewish, that actually applies to when they were in America. I don't really know much about how they felt about being Jewish in Europe, because they don't really talk about it. My guess would be that it was, well, actually, I don't know if I should even make a guess, but I think after coming to America, they really tried to separate themselves from the past, and being Jewish was part of the past, and it connected with the Holocaust, right? But also, I think they really tried to establish themselves as professionals. Like that's who we are. We're professional women, or not even women, because that was another issue that really wasn't important to them, which was kind of disappointing to find out. But again, different times. We look at that through, ways of feminism, but they looked at it differently. It wasn't important to them that there were women, that wasn't important they were Jewish. What they wanted to say is, we're professionals, we came here, we can work hard, and reestablish ourselves and start our lives anew in this new environment. But some of them talk about experiencing anti-Semitism here in America too.
I think there's a question over here.
So do we know any of them, because you're a mental health professional?
Yeah.
Do any of them talk about working with survivors? And that you would think that would be certainly something that they would want to do or be able to do.
Yes, there's one exception, which I didn't get to, but I can maybe skip to now. That was Judith Kestenberg, the one who was raised Orthodox with this very strong identity, Jewish identity, that she preserved. And that's an exception, really. I mean, Alberta Shalit is another one who wrote about the mourning process, but Kestenberg is the main exception. And what happened with her is that she immigrated in 1937. She continued her psychoanalytic training, and then the war started. Her entire family was there in Europe. She managed to help her brother, and her sister also immigrated, but the rest of the family stayed. And then in 1945, she discovered that her parents perished in the Shoah. And she went into this phase of complete rejection and silence. She didn't want to hear, and that lasted until 1968. She didn't want to hear anything about the Holocaust. If anyone started a conversation, she would just walk out the door. She didn't want to hear anything about it. And then in 1968, she had a patient who was a child of Holocaust survivors. And this patient, I'm going to read you a quote from her for the case. He, quote, behaved very strangely. He did not eat any food, hid in forest, and treated Kestenberg as a hostile persecutor. He looked like someone in a concentration camp. So she saw something that was later called a intergenerational transmission of trauma. So the child was actually born after the war, started to, and that she saw many more patients like this, especially when they reached the age at which their parents were when they suffered this persecution. They would start to look like those parents, behave like those parents. So she got into, so she called them children of survivors, and she started putting together study groups, but also like setting up meetings for them to meet up and talk about this. And that was a brand new field. No one really did that before. And she also started sending letters to her colleagues around the world and saying, looking for patients who would meet those requirements. And people would say, psychoanalysts and other mental health professionals would write her back and say, it really just didn't really care about that at all, because and she discovered that there was, she calls it a prohibition against discussing the past that came from mental health professionals. And then she discovered another case when it was a boy who was born in the ghetto and then deported to a concentration camp, at the age of 2. And then she called people like this child survivors, and she started researching them. And then until her death, for the next 40 years or so, that's what she did. 30 years. She only worked with children of survivors and child survivors, as she called them. She set up institutes, study groups, and so on. And she traveled around the world and interviewed them and collected those testimonies with her colleagues. They collected 1,500 testimonies from children 13 and younger. That was her focus. Her husband, Milton, was a lawyer, and he was at the same time trying to, so the German courts refused to acknowledge that children who were very young during the Holocaust or born even during the Holocaust deserved any compensation, because they would say, well, they were not traumatized, they were too young to be traumatized. So he actually started this project of helping them remember, to bring it out so they can remember. And then I talked to Kestenberg's daughter and son, and they both told me that she was completely, and that's not my word, obsessed with her work. Like if she had a birthday party, she would have it as a fundraiser for the Holocaust victims. If she traveled for holidays, she always interviewed people, and so on and so on. So that's an exception, her going from complete silence and repression to just being in a way obsessed with that work. And at the same time, she was trying, I wrote a whole paper about her because it's a fascinating story. She was trying to work through her losses and her traumas, but I don't think she fully did, but she was working through that. But that's an absolute exception.
So the others were not involved at all?
No, there was no, from what I know, there was no trauma or loss connected to the Holocaust in their work at all. They avoided it.
Yes, Jennifer.
I'm interested in this professional transition from working in Europe to working in America, because, you know, even without the traumatic circumstances and without, you know, the multiplicity of identities that these women were dealing with, psychoanalysis is so personal, and the individual is also steeped in certain narratives about their life, like based on the cultural narratives that they live in. And so I'm curious, what was it like for them to go from treating European patients to treating American patients? Did they have to change the way that they practiced? Did they have certain commentary on their US patients at all?
I don't know that, because one reason is that that was like on the side for me. I wasn't interested in that much, but also with with patient files, the thing is that they're confidential. You can't really, unless it's like with Kestenberg, what I quoted, she published a case study. If they didn't publish those, there's no way of really knowing. But I'm not an expert on this, but psychoanalysis, there was a whole shift in psychoanalysis between Europe and the United States, and there are so many different psychoanalysis, so many different paths, so many different schools and approaches. I was most interested in how the transfer went from something that was a political, cultural, social project into something that became this luxurious, prestigious medical profession. And I know that many of those women continue to, it feels like they continue to cherish the original principle of psychoanalysis, which was so that it is accessible to as many people as possible, so it is accessible to people who can afford it. Because, for example, in Berlin Training Institute, every psychoanalyst had to treat one patient for free. And as a rule, they adjust in Europe, in all institutes, they adjusted fees to the capabilities of their patients. And same with training. If you wanted to train, you just had to talk about the fees, and they were lowered. Not for Americans, by the way, but I mean, the rule was to milk the Americans. But yeah, they did this because that's what Freud wanted. That's how he saw psychoanalysis as something that's accessible, that spreads and helps as many people as possible. And that was not the case here at all. But some of those women it's hard to, I don't have comprehensive stories of every one of those women, unfortunately, but what I've gathered is a lot of them did that too. But I can't really answer your question fully.
Comments, questions, thoughts?
I wish you could have given an even longer presentation.
I know. I have so many crossed out pages. It was very hard to make it short.
It's going to be a book.
Well, I wrote papers about several of those women that I was able to get more information about, especially if I was able to interview their descendants and those who knew them. I don't think it's gonna be a book, but I don't know. I have so many projects, but because I discovered this one person, Klara Happel, and when I was talking to her grandson, he told me that he said, which was amazing too, because sometimes you talk to someone, they're like, really? My mom did that? Yeah. I don't know. And sometimes you talk to someone who's like, yes, finally, I have all of this. I have this. I traveled. I saw their house. And so he was one of those people. And he said to me at some point during one of the conversations we had, he said, hey, I have those documents. Do you want them? I never showed them to anyone. And I said, of course. And there were letters from Freud and many other people falling apart almost. But so I decided to write a book about her. Her story is also very unique because she was one of, I think, most probably the only one out of those 87 who did not have a so-called success story. She ended up committing a suicide in 1945. She was someone who did not readjust and to here in America for a number of reasons. But I'm also interested in her because she was very politically active. And that's also contributed to her not being able to resettle here because, I'm sure you know, but those who are socialists, they had to hide it here. So I'm writing a book about her. And I think that's going to be kind of a summary of this project, because a lot of my work is going to go into that book. But I think it's just going to be a better book than a book about 22 women.
Wonderful. Let's thank Klara once again for fantastic. Feel free to visit and have further questions.